On this Monday night, the blistering heat wave baking Europe, getting too hot to handle.
Anywhere that you have to stay in the sun for a long time, that's off limits.
The transportation concerns and deadly wildfires. The feds pitching pollution solutions. The options to slash Canada's oil and gas emissions. Chilling police body cam footage of the Uvalde massacre.
We gotta get in there, he keeps shooting.
The failed negotiation with the gunman. And paying for their sins. The Catholic Church's plan to compensate abuse victims.
Global National with Donna Friesen. Reporting tonight, Tracy Tong.
Good evening and thank you for joining us. A heat wave is scorching parts of Western Europe, triggering wildfires in Portugal, France and Spain, and forcing tens of thousands of people to flee from their homes. This train full of passengers in northwest Spain got stuck as vegetation burned up in flames near the tracks. Almost the entire country faces an extreme fire risk. And the UK, which is unprepared for the extreme heat, is struggling with sweltering temperatures, with the next few days forecast to get even hotter. Our Redmond Shannon has our top story tonight from London.
This just doesn't feel very British. A head-melting heat. The rising mercury felt by locals and tourists alike.
It's not quite as humid as it is back home when it's hot, but there's no air conditioning here, which is what surprises me.
The UK just isn't set up for these types of temperatures. The school year goes well into July in some buildings which just aren't designed for the heat.
Some schools have had to close.
We can't expect much learning to go on in this sort of heat, is the frank reality.
One of London's main airports stopped flights for hours while workers repaired a section of melting runway. And train services have been delayed over concerns tracks are buckling. A growing acceptance Britain may need to adapt to a new future.
We will learn over the next 48 hours about how the rail system copes with this kind of heat, which it wasn't built to cope with. We will learn about how we deal, as a community with heat.
And it does worry me a lot, and my colleagues here in the Met Office, that this sort of unprecedented heat could be a regular occurrence by the end of the century.
In southern Europe, the worries are also more immediate. Heat now blamed for hundreds of deaths and bellowing wildfires that have killed at least 2 people in Spain.
Una evidencia, y es que el cambio climático mata.
The country's prime minister saying it shows that climate change kills. This man somehow survived, running for his life after trying to protect his village from flames. Thousands have had to flee their homes in France too, with local records being broken across the country.
Here within the UK, Wales broke its all-time temperature record on Monday, but on Tuesday we're expected to see the entire UK break its record of 38.7 degrees and a temperature of above 40 for the first time on record. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
Well, scorching temperatures causing problems across parts of Canada as well. A wildfire close to Lytton, BC, a village wiped out by flames last year, is still out of control. It's one of dozens of wildfires burning in British Columbia, Alberta and Saskatchewan. And in northern Manitoba, heavy smoke hampered evacuation efforts on the Matthias-Colomb Cree Nation. As Jayme Doll reports, that blaze is burning less than a kilometer away from homes.
Shrouded in a smoky orange hue with just one bag of belongings strapped to their backs, an entire community is forced out by a threatening and out-of-control wildfire spanning 23,000 hectares.
Everything was smoky. We had to wipe everything down and get rid of the smell. And some people wanted to bring their dogs, but they weren't allowed.
Leo Sinclair, his wife and son, among approximately 2,000 people evacuated from the Matthias-Colomb Cree First Nation in northern Manitoba, one of dozens of fires burning in that province. There are no accessible roads here in the summer, so trains, planes, helicopters, all brought into the remote community, some people leaving in the dead of night.
First day was so chaotic.
The evacuation began Thursday and only ended late Sunday.
Virtually everyone is out of the community, and now we're supporting them in hotels in Winnipeg, Brandon, Thompson, and The Paw.
I'm okay, as long as nothing burns.
In British Columbia, hot, dry and windy conditions are helping to fuel a fire burning near the already fire-ravaged village of Lytton. That blaze is consuming just over 1,700 hectares. 132 firefighters on the ground and a fleet of helicopters are working to prevent further damage to the devastated area. While a cool and wet spring has meant a substantially slower start to fire season in BC this year, the recent heat is increasing the wildfire risk.
As right now, we are seeing that warm and drying trend coming throughout the week. So we are seeing the potential of smaller ignitions through those dried grass and those dried valley bottoms.
Many of the fires currently burning in BC and Manitoba remain in the north, and the smoke is lingering there too. Unfortunate for those living in remote areas, but city skies remain clear. And so far this summer, the majority of Canadians are breathing easy, at least for now. Jayme Doll, Global News, Calgary.
Extreme heat warnings are also in place across a large swath of Texas and the U.S. Central Plains, sparking concerns about the electrical grid and millions of hectares of crops. Texans have been asked to voluntarily reduce their electricity use to help avoid rolling blackouts. With a series of days in the high 30s, farmers across much of the central U.S. say they're seeing drought-like conditions developing quickly. And back on home soil, the federal government is proposing a cap on oil and gas emissions by putting an industry-specific price on carbon. Ottawa is aiming to cut greenhouse gases by 42% across all sectors by 2030 to reduce the devastating impacts global warming is having on the environment, like those raging wildfires that are becoming way too frequent. Abigail Bimman reports.
The oil and gas sector is responsible for nearly a third of all greenhouse gas emissions in this country, the #1 source. Until now, there hadn't been a plan for how the industry factors into the government's push to net zero by 2050.
This is a complex piece of policy.
The government is opening consultations looking at two options to drive down emissions 42% by 2030, a cap-and-trade system or a modified carbon tax. But no specifics are included on how much carbon pricing could increase from the $170 per ton it will reach by 2030 or what a cap may look like.
What we've said since the election last year is that we would cap at current emissions, current levels. So is it 2021, 2022? I think that would be a reasonable assumption.
There's not much specific because there's a whole problem with it. If you impose too hard a cap, you're forcing industry to try and adapt too quickly. It may not be possible. And what happens then is potentially companies just shut down production.
The cap itself would focus on emissions, not production. But oil production is an even more sensitive topic given Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the world looking for other sources of energy. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers warns the ideas could be counterproductive to achieving climate goals, saying imposing an emissions cap solely on Canada's oil and natural gas sector, as the paper proposes, will likely drive energy investment into other countries who may not share our high environmental and human rights standards.
We have to be walking and chewing gum at the same time.
This environmentalist wants to make sure consultations don't slow down the other emissions-slashing projects underway, and she feels a tinkering with the carbon tax would be too complicated, especially with some provincial opposition.
What did this government promise to do with oil and gas emissions? They promised to cap those emissions and make sure that they declined. And so I think the most straightforward way to do that would be by implementing a cap.
Those who want to weigh in on either option have until the end of September to respond, and the government hopes to deliver a plan by early next year. Abigail Bimman, Global News, Ottawa.
Brampton, Ontario Mayor Patrick Brown says he will be seeking another term in office, fresh off being disqualified from the federal Conservative leadership race.
I've come to the conclusion that based on what the actions taken, that it would be impossible to have a free and fair election at this point when ballots have already been sent out.
Earlier this month, Brown was disqualified from the running for leader of the Conservatives over an alleged violation of Elections Canada financing rules. Brown accused the Pierre Poilievre campaign of pushing for his expulsion, which the Poilievre camp denies. Brampton's municipal election takes place on October 24th. Ballots are now out in the Conservative leadership race, with the results announced on September 10th. Emergency departments are struggling to provide essential care across the country. some forced to close yet again over the weekend. And while ER delays aren't a new issue in Canada, experts say wait times and closures are climbing at an unprecedented rate. As Jayme Doll reports, there is growing concern Canadians will be left scrambling for help when they need it the most.
Morgan Lanigan and his wife Kelly were at their cottage in New Brunswick when a pain she was experiencing became so severe they rushed her to the nearest emergency room.
They basically said we're at overcapacity and we can't see you, and that the regional hospital ER is also over capacity as well. So that's when we kind of had to face a really critical moment at that point.
Suffer or drive an hour to Fredericton, where they arrived to another full waiting room. From Vancouver Island to Newfoundland and Labrador, Canadian hospitals have had to turn patients away, clawing back hours and temporarily closing their doors.
We've always viewed our work and our career as being one that is available for you 24/7, no matter what, any time of day. However, we're seeing that we're not able to deliver on that promise anymore.
In Alberta, there have been 19 disruptions to emergency and ambulatory care facilities since the beginning of June. The province's official opposition says new data also shows ambulance response times have worsened and red alerts where there's no ambulances available have increased in frequency.
The system has been run far too lean for far too long.
The Alberta government says its system is not collapsing, but this Toronto emergency room doctor argues it already has.
I see it with my own eyes that even in the urban centers like where I work, the wait times are longer and patients' families are having to make difficult choices.
On Sunday, Montreal Children's Hospital was forced to turn patients away due to overcrowding. And in BC, 4 interior hospitals announced temporary diversions.
I'm hearing now that ambulance crews were unaware and showed up with a patient on the overnight shift and had to, after arriving at the hospital doors in Clearwater, had to divert to Kamloops.
That's an hour and a half away. No matter where you end up, ER physicians are warning there's likely to be a wait.
There needs to be planning, and us on the front lines, we can only do so much. We try to help as much as we can. We lack the power to coordinate the whole system.
That, health experts say, will require the attention of all levels of government. But many Canadians don't have the luxury of time for policy to catch up to reality. Jayme Doll, Global News, Toronto.
A high-level shakeup in Ukraine's government. Coming up, why the president has suspended 2 of his top advisors. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has suspended 2 members of his inner circle and launched investigations into his country's intelligence agency and prosecution service over allegations of Russian collaborators in those departments. The shakeup comes as Russian forces have stepped up their onslaught in eastern Ukraine, and as Russia's largest gas exporter is warning European nations it can no longer guarantee future supplies. Mike Armstrong reports.
The surprise announcement came in a televised speech Sunday night. Vladimir Zelensky suspending 2 of the most powerful people in his government. Just last Thursday, Irina Venediktova was representing Ukraine in The Hague, coordinating with other countries over investigations into war crimes. As Ukraine's prosecutor general, Venediktova has been a high-profile and vocal figure. She's been front and center. The other suspended official hasn't had quite the same profile, but he does have very close ties to Zelensky himself. Ivan Bakanov was the head of the SBU, Ukraine's spy agency, but he and Zelensky were childhood friends, and he ran Zelensky's presidential campaign. Zelensky suspended the 2, saying members of their agencies are suspected of conspiring with Russia. He said there are 651 cases of alleged treason and collaboration being investigated.
Clearly, the Russians have been building this capability. They have tried to undermine the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian state for a long time.
Now, Russia's applying a different pressure on other European countries this week. Russian gas exporter Gazprom has sent out letters to several customers declaring something called force majeure. It means it won't be able to send as much fuel as it was contracted to send due to something out of its control. It's a sort of act of God clause. There is fear Russia could move to cut off supplies completely. Countries are now trying to refill storage sites before winter and the heating season. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
The police's point of view. Ahead, the body cam video from the Uvalde school mass shooting. A leading figure of the Freedom Convoy movement has been released on bail.
Freedom! 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 Freedom!
Pat King spent 5 months in an Ottawa jail for his role in leading the protests that choked the city's downtown core for weeks. King is facing a raft of criminal charges in connection to those protests, including mischief, intimidation, and obstructing police. And in April, he was also charged with perjury and obstruction of justice. There is a publication ban on the evidence and reasons for the court's decision, but King will need to abide by multiple conditions as part of his release. A new report into the Uvalde school shooting describes what's being called a systematic breakdown, highlighting how the safeguards designed to protect students failed. And newly released police body cam footage shows the chaos of that horrific day when 19 children and 2 teachers were killed. Jackson Prosco reports, and a warning, some of the images in this story are disturbing.
Almost immediately, police came under fire as they rushed into Robb Elementary.
My wife's classroom.
The moments that followed descended into a chaotic, uncoordinated response.
Dude, we gotta get in there. We gotta get in there. He just keeps shooting. We gotta get in there.
Police spent more than an hour waiting for instructions as nearly 400 officers descended on the school. As bursts of gunfire erupted from a classroom, School District Police Chief Pete Arredondo even tried to negotiate with the suspect.
Let me know if there's any kids in there or anything. This could be peaceful.
Outside, other officers rushed to break windows and rescue students.
Go, run over there.
No one breached the classroom until it was too late.
If you know there's active shooting, active killing going on, or somebody is dying, the standard is you have to continue to do something to stop that killing or stop that dying.
The first report into the massacre found officers put their own safety over that of the innocent victims. There was no clear leadership, no proper communication.
They don't protect nothing. They're cowards.
The school itself had issues too. Poor Wi-Fi delayed lockdown alerts. No one used the school intercom to communicate the threat.
The police failed us. The school system failed us. Those failures costed our son his life.
The report concludes most of the victims died within minutes, but some could have been saved if police had acted sooner. This devastating look at police actions has left families wondering if anyone will be held accountable for the failures of that day. Jackson Prosco, Global News, Washington.
In Florida, the trial for the Parkland school shooter started today. Family members of the 17 people shot and killed at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in 2018 were at the courthouse for opening statements. In October, Nicholas Cruz, who is now 23 years old, pleaded guilty to 17 counts of first-degree murder. Jurors will decide whether he is sentenced to death or gets life in prison without parole. And jury selection has started at the trial of Donald Trump's former chief strategist. Steve Bannon is facing charges of criminal contempt of Congress after initially defying a subpoena issued by the committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. The trial is going ahead, even though earlier this month, Bannon notified the committee he is now willing to testify. If he's found guilty, he faces up to 2 years behind bars. Atoning for abuse. Next, how the Catholic Church plans to compensate victims. Ahead of Pope Francis's visit to Canada next week, the Supreme Court of Newfoundland and Labrador has approved the sale of 42 properties belonging to the Catholic Church, including 12 churches. The money from the sale will be used to settle legal claims by victims of sexual and physical abuse at a church-run orphanage. As Ross Lord reports, the sale items contain rich history and even papal connections.
Even decades after the systemic abuse of boys at Newfoundland's Mount Cashel orphanage, accountability is slow.
At night time, they'll come to your bed. I won't describe it in detail.
Compensating more than 100 victims, most of whom are now elderly men, will cost the Catholic Church an estimated tens of millions of dollars. To raise the money, church leaders in St. John's are turning to the real estate market. In an update to parishioners, Archbishop Peter Hunt said 42 properties are for sale, including 12 churches, and that only a few will continue to be used as Catholic churches. The Archbishop called it an emotional and distressing process. The properties being sold are worth an estimated $20 million. Among them, this grotto in the community of Flat Rock, where Pope John Paul II visited in 1984, kneeling to pray and bestowing a special blessing on the grotto. But the big stunner is this, the province's most famous church, the Basilica of St. John the Baptist. The basilica has stood as a stately landmark in St. John's since it was built almost 2 centuries ago. Court documents show the basilica will be sold to a heritage foundation, which promises to preserve it.
What has happened here seems to have been the best possible resolution, in that the basilica will still be available for the Catholic community, but the value of the basilica will go towards compensating survivors.
The Catholic Church has had trouble following through on promises. Church entities agreed to raise $25 million for residential school survivors in Canada, then came up with less than $4 million. Officials suggest dozens of other Newfoundland church properties could go on the block, promising they intend to meet their legal obligations to victims while restructuring their organization in a positive way. Ross Lord, Global News.
And that is Global National for this Monday night. I'm Tracy Tong. Tonight's Your Canada is Lower Island Cove, Newfoundland and Labrador. Thanks for watching. Jeff Semple will be at the anchor desk tomorrow. Have a good night.